Now, before we can start building any really cool, fancy projects and learning about the intricacies of JavaScript, we first need to understand what exactly JavaScript is and why it's so important to learn JavaScript. And it's kind of difficult to understand what JavaScript is because it encompasses a lot of the modern web technologies as well as things outside of web development. But in essence, JavaScript is essentially the thing on your site, your website, that makes your website interactable. So maybe when you click a button and a pop-up appears, that's JavaScript. When you click a button and it does something, that's JavaScript. Maybe you want to wait for some interaction. Maybe the user hovers over something and a pop-up appears or something changes on your page. That is JavaScript. Essentially, anytime that you're changing or moving or modifying your page in any way, you're using JavaScript in order to do that. And that is on the browser. But JavaScript is actually so much more than just a tool for modifying things inside of your browser. One of the most popular ways JavaScript is used is in something called Node.js, which is a server-side framework for running JavaScript as a server. So not only can you run JavaScript on the client inside of your browser, modifying your web page, but also you can use JavaScript on the backend on a server in order to facilitate requests to your server, serving out web pages, or just doing anything you want with that server. So it can be used both on the browser and also on a server in the backend. And on top of that, you can even create mobile and desktop applications using JavaScript. I mean, for example, Visual Studio Code is entirely built with JavaScript. You have something like Slack, which is again built with JavaScript, and tons of other desktop applications you're used to using most likely have some element of JavaScript built into them, whether it's on the server, on their website, or in their desktop application. So JavaScript is literally everywhere, which is why it is so important to learn JavaScript, because whether you're working as a web developer, a server developer, a desktop developer, a mobile developer, chances are you're going to run into JavaScript at some point. Even if it's just a little bit of JavaScript here and there, you're going to run into it and you need to understand how to write it. And going a little further in depth on what exactly JavaScript is, it is technically a scripting language, which essentially means that JavaScript is very similar to things like PHP or Ruby in the fact that these languages are not compiled. So normally if you write code in something like C, C++, or Java, this code is going to be taken from what you write. So you write out some code and then the machine does some computation and turns it into essentially machine readable code. So it takes what you wrote and converts it into something else that the machine, your computer, can understand. With scripting languages like JavaScript, you don't actually convert your code. You take exactly what you write word for word and you send that to the computer, and the computer knows how to read what you wrote word for word without any compilation step in between. This is why when you're on a website, you can actually view the exact JavaScript code that they wrote to make that website work inside of the browser. This is actually one of the best ways to figure out how things are done and to debug and fix problems that you have in your website, because you can easily just view this code that you wrote exactly as it is without having to worry about uncompiling that code and trying to figure out what it actually meant based on the compilation. That's a really nice thing about JavaScript, is that it's just whatever you write is exactly what the machine or the computer reads in order to do the thing you want it to do. It just gets rid of that unnecessary step that other languages have to go through. Now, I don't want to go any further in depth into the details of what JavaScript is, because it's difficult to understand unless you're actually sitting there writing JavaScript. So in the next video, I'm going to show you all the tools you need to download in order to follow along with this course, so we can get started writing JavaScript as quickly as possible.